Hello everybody and welcome back to the DCS World Series. Today we are talking about the newly released AH-64D Apache, where I'm going to give you some tips and tricks from a noob's perspective that will hopefully help you guys get the aircraft up and flying. Okay guys, so as I said, it is very important to remember that I have had this aircraft just as long as you have, and that these are absolutely tips and tricks from a noob. And the purpose of this video is just to get you guys up and flying it and get you comfortable with it, so that way you can start setting it up to your liking. So we're going to be talking about controls that are immediately needed to get comfortable with it, as well as some settings that may help you guys get operational here. So let's go ahead and get started with the basics here. The first thing I recommend doing is coming here to the special menu in your settings tab, and unless you have a force feedback stick, but if you're like me and you're using like the Thrustmaster Warthog or something like that, and you like the trimmer mode that you saw like in the Huey, recommend setting this to central position trimmer mode. And what this does is you basically pitch the cyclic, or the rudder pedals in this case as well, to the position that you want the aircraft to be in. And then you tap a trimmer button and then recenter your flight control surfaces. Okay, and we'll be demonstrating that when we are in the aircraft. Now, I don't think that's necessarily the realistic mode by any means, but this should hopefully give you guys an easier time flying it. That is the nice part about simulation. The other thing I do recommend doing when you're learning is disabling the IHAD's monocle in this case, and you guys are going to hear me refer to it all the time as the HMD. It's a bad habit, I get it, but I'm used to flying the A10, the F16, the F18, where is the head-mounted display, or G.Skill in this case. Anyway, so I do recommend disabling that because it makes the cockpit more clear. It sort of just, it's a nice way to transition into adding more and more to what's in front of you. Just a recommendation. So now let's go ahead and get into the cockpit, and then we'll talk about some controls. Okay, so now that we're in the cockpit, I want to re-emphasize that everything that I'm going to show you is what's required just to get the aircraft up and flying. If you want to get started up, you want to fly around the airbase, just sort of get familiar, get an idea of how it handles. That's all that the purpose of this tutorial today is. So, and I don't even know how to call it a tutorial, tips and tricks, okay? So let's get into the controls. The controls that you're definitely going to want today, in my opinion, is first the I key. This will hide the HMD, much like we can do with the G.Skill and the F18 and things like that, where you can remove the head-mounted display from your field of view. And that's really nice, especially when you're starting the aircraft up and getting familiar with where all the controls are. That's the first one. Next one that you're going to want is definitely the Symbology select down and up, and we're going to talk about what those are once we get the aircraft started and ready for taxi and takeoff. Okay, now you can also bind, if you have the ability, this Symbology depress switch, but it is not required, and I'm going to show you why once we get the aircraft up and running. This is totally a preference thing in my personal opinion, and it's certainly not something that is required if you're limited on keybinds. If you are limited on keybinds, I do recommend checking out a really awesome tool that has been around for a while in the DCS community, and that is RS Mapper. I will leave a link down to that download down in the description below if you guys want to check it out. I also have tutorial videos, one of which is actually posted on the DCS forums post for the downloaded for the software link, so you guys will be able to see that and see what it does and how it functions. It makes mapping your controls a bit easier, and then it brings some additional functionality that isn't built into DCS natively. The one stipulation is you do have to have keyboard commands set up inside DCS in order to use it. Okay, so you're going to want Symbology select up and down. That is a must. Okay, you're going to want your trim mode up, definitely. And then for this tutorial, I'm going to show you the trim mode attitude hold. That's what the AT means. And D, which I believe is disable, but don't quote me on that. I do know that whatever it does, it disables it. So I'm assuming that's what it is. I have not been able to make the altitude hold work, which is what I believe this is. I don't know if I'm doing something wrong with it yet, so I won't be trying to demonstrate that today. However, that is another option for key binding. I'm trying to think of anything else that is a requirement for today's flight, and I don't think... Oh, we do have one more, and that is going to be the tail wheel lock button depress. This is a button that's on the collective that will lock and unlock the tail wheel. The tail wheel is essentially a caster, and when it's in its straight and level position, you can actually lock it, which drops a pin down in it, which keeps it from castering back and forth. You unlock it, that pin is lifted up, and then when you use the anti-torque rotor, it will push that tail wheel one direction or the other, allowing it to cast, much like the front wheels of a shopping cart do. Okay. It's really important to remember to unlock this when you are steering it on the ground, because the aircraft will rotate even if the wheel is locked, but it's important to remember that the tail wheel at that point is being pushed and dragged across the concrete versus actually turning and rolling with the directional push. Okay. Let's go into axis assignments real quick. There's a few there that you're going to want to take a peek at. If you're like myself, I'm using the Thrustmaster Warthog. Okay, we're going to have our collective. I am using the right throttle on the or the right axis on the Thrustmaster Warthog throttle for the collective. And for power levers, the Apache has two engines, so you have two power levers. In this case, I'm setting one axis to both, which is going to be my left throttle axis. And then you also want to bind your HOCAS, or hands-on collective and stick. This is much like think of this as nothing more than the TDC that we have in the F-18, F-16, A-10, etc. So your TDC slew and how you want to set that up. Now for the Thrustmaster Warthog, and I'll demonstrate this once we get everything started, I have found that a tuning settings of a 5 dead zone and 20 curvature work really well. And be sure to map that the same way on the Y, on the vertical axis, but make sure you invert it. But I do have that set obviously the same, and it works very, very smoothly. It's not too dramatic one direction or the other, even at full axis. Finally, I have the TPR rudder pedals. With the left and right toe brakes, the other thing that I had to do was invert them as well. Otherwise, when my feet are off of my rudder pedals, the brakes are actually depressed, and when I pushed down on them, it was releasing the brake. So I did have to invert those axes as well. So that's something to keep an eye out for. And then obviously rudder axis for the anti-torque rotor. Okay, and if there's anything else, obviously I will address that as we get into the startup process, but I don't think there's anything else that we need for today's flight. So let's go ahead and get started with that. Now we're going to go ahead and start up the aircraft. So the first thing that we're going to want to do is obviously close the canopy. Now it's important to remember that, again, I'm going to mention this a couple times because I don't want people saying, oh, this isn't a tutorial, this is crap. No, it's not a tutorial. It's very much so tips and tricks. And hopefully we will get to full-blown tutorials, but I'm not good enough and not claiming to be. I'm just trying to help people out. The reason why I'm mentioning that again is because I'm going to skip, I'm sure, a ton of the startup process. It's just get the aircraft up and running to where you can fly it without any issues. So we're going to come down to the bottom here, and we're going to right-click and turn the battery on. We can come back here and turn our anti-collision lights to white. Okay, with the battery now turned on, you can see that there's that tail wheel lock select, indicating that the tail wheel is locked. Another good indication here is if the light here is not illuminated, the tail wheel is locked. When it is unlocked, you will see an unlock right here. And the reason why I point this out is because this will not always display. Okay, so that's important to remember. Now, next part of our startup procedures, we're going to lift the APU cover, give it a click, and give it a push. Okay, and then we will see APU start and APU power on illuminating up here on the control screen here. And once we see APU on, we are clear to begin the rest of the engine start process. So I'm going to hang tight until that is complete. Now, here is the helmet mounted display. Or the, I already forgot what it was called. We're just going to call it the HMD because I already forgot it again. I swore to myself I was going to remember for the video, but I forgot what it was called. This is where the I key comes in handy. If you tap I, it turns it on and off. Okay, and so that makes it really handy. As you can see here, when you leave it on, it just sort of adds one more step to look through when you're learning. And so I do recommend, until you're ready to fly, disabling. When you're ready to fly, you're going to want it on. Now, the other thing is the master warning and master caution. You're going to be pushing master warning quite a few times during the startup process. So we're going to clear those, and I'm going to show you guys real quick on the controls. I have M set as the master caution, and I have right shift and M set as my master warning, and you can bind those to, I have mine to the landing gear silence alarm on my throttle, but it's totally up to you guys how you guys want to do this. And I have it set with your RS mapper where a short press will trigger the master warning button and a long press will disable the master caution alert. And again, master warning is up here, master caution is down below. All right, so our APU is now on. You can see that the power on went away and the APU start went away, indicating that the APU is ready for use. The other thing is you can see there's our TDC cursor there. And again, I know that's the wrong verbiage. Just work with me here. Okay, but here's the full motion based on the settings that I was showing you guys earlier. So it's really not bad at all. And if I want to just barely move it, I can. Okay, so if I wanted to get it over the 0, boom. So if you guys like those settings, that's about what you can expect by following those settings that I showed. And again, that is for the Thrustmaster Warthog. All right, so now let's get into the engine start process. So for the engine start process, we always want to start the left engine first, then the right. But we're going to do those obviously independently. So first, just a real quick right click of the engine start switch. So just tap. And there's that first master warning, so we're going to tap that. We're looking for 20% here on the NG. Once you get to 20%, we're going to do left alt and home. And then you get a master warning again. And now we're going to wait for the engine to stabilize. So I'll come back to you as soon as it's idle so you guys know what to look for. Okay, so with the first engine running at idle, this is what you can expect to see. About 10% on the torque, 66.5% on the NG. Now let's rinse and repeat the process for the right engine. Tap again. And again, this time it's going to be right shift and home. There's that master warning again. And now we'll wait for both engines to be at idle, and I'll show you guys what the screen should look like then. All right, and here's what we can expect to see with both engines at idle. Okay, so now what we're going to do is using my power lever, and this is going to move. It's my left throttle on my HOTAS, but it's going to move both of the power levers forward. We're going to move them to the fly position here, but we're going to do it slowly. If you move it too fast, my understanding is the engine crank spins faster than the rotor does. It might be the other way around, but anyway, you can cause some damage. So you want to be real gentle with the acceleration. And we should stabilize right about 85-86% on the NG. Which again is this one right here, and sit right about 101% on the power. Okay. And at this point now, we can turn off the APU and close the cover. Oh, and also one more thing before you start. Epic fail on my part. Make sure the parking brake is set. Okay, so for our purposes today, in just flying the aircraft and getting comfortable, we are ready to get going. So let's go ahead and do so. All right, so the first thing that I'm going to do is talk about taxiing. Now, I do recommend leaving your HMD up here. And again, I know it's not what it's called. I know someone's going to say it in the comments. But what we're going to watch for is you have your engine torque here, okay? And then this circle right here in the middle of this crosshair, think of it as a top-down view of what the aircraft is doing. Meaning that the further the circle gets away from the crosshair, the greater the movement the aircraft is making in that particular direction. For example, if the circle gets moved way up here, you can bet your butt that we're taxiing, or in this case, doesn't have to be taxi, but our forward momentum is increasing. If this little circle gets way up there, or a big line gets way up there, we're moving very quickly. Okay, and then same thing with any of the other directions. If we're back over here, we're moving slightly to the left and to the rear. Okay, or maybe dramatically, depending again how far that is away. Now here's where the symbology modes come into play. Okay, let's bring this down for just a second so I can show you guys. And I'm going to go back to the controls for a second just so we know we're all on the same page. Symbology up, symbology down, symbology depressed. This is what we're talking about now. Okay, so this is one of the Symbology up positions, and this is called the transition mode. Okay, and then you have transition Symbology up again, and you go into flight mode. Notice you have the pitch scale. Now, if you want a very, very good detailed getting started video, I recommend watching Cosmos. He did a really good job. Obviously, the guy's a pro based on the information that, I think he's an ex-AH-64 pilot. He's obviously knows his stuff. But he did happen to mention, I wanted to relay that to you guys as well, that not many pilots use this particular mode unless they're up high or maybe just looking for some better reference of pitch angle. But for the most part, it's not particularly used. Now, how you cycle between the two is simply by continuing to push Symbology up. So we're going to stay in transition mode here. Now, the other thing I wanted to show you guys is when you're in transition mode, if we hit the Symbology depress button. This is the one that I told you was not required. Okay, and here's why it's not required. If you hit the depress button, that's all it does is on the left PFD there changes it to the flight mode where you get your pitch scale and your watermark and your horizon lines, etc. Okay, so if that's something that you like, cool, but you can also do that directly from the PFD menu here. You don't have to use it from that depress button. You can get to this screen without using that. This is just a very fast and efficient way to do so. So again, if you're limited on buttons, you don't have to bind that. Now the other one that we're going to go is we're going to talk about Symbology down. Symbology down is the hover modes. The way to think about the hover mode is the closer this circle is to the center of this crosshair, the closer you are to a hover. Okay, ideally, if it is locked just super tight inside these four crosshairs, you are in a hover. Then you have a Symbology down again, and you get the hover bobber mode. I hope I'm saying that right. And what this is basically a target, if you will. This is telling the aircraft, I want to hover at this location. And the idea behind it is then to steer the aircraft so that way this little circle is always inside of this octagon here. Okay, so it just, again, it gives you a position in space in which you want to hover, and I'll try to demonstrate that here in a little bit, but I'm not particularly good with the hovers yet. I'm going to be blunt. Okay, so, but that's what those modes do. I find myself staying in this one or this one. So the hover mode or transition mode, I am finding to be the most comfortable to fly with. Okay, it's got the least obstruction on the screen and the least things to worry about. All right, so now let's talk about the taxi. So I'm going to bring us back up, and what we're going to be watching for here is the torque. This is our engine torque percent. Okay, and before I do that, let me release that parking brake. There we go. Let's get this back up. I'm not using a head tracker on purpose. I'm trying to keep the screen as static as possible for you guys. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase my torque slowly. Now you're going to watch the torque actually fluctuate a little bit, but what we're going to be looking for is I found with a completely clean aircraft like we have here, I have found that right about 22-23% is really nice. The other thing you want to watch for is this guy here. This is our ground speed. Okay, it's giving us our ground speed. So we're going to accelerate to about 23% on the torque, give or take. Let's keep adding power till we get there. Right about there, 22, 23. And now, instead of using a throttle to taxi, we're just going to push the cyclic forward. And how much we push that cyclic forward is going to determine how much forward momentum we get. Okay, now notice that because we're in transition mode, we also get that flight path indicator that's bouncing around up there. Okay, that is telling you where the aircraft is going to end up. Okay, now if I simply recenter the cyclic, for the most part the aircraft will slow itself right back down to a stop. However, for any reason you need to stop it rapidly, you can also go aft on the cyclic and either go into reverse or stop the aircraft abruptly, you know, sort of like using the rotor as a brake. Or you can just, I don't know, hit the brakes. It's up to you. It really depends on what you're doing. Now, I do like the transition mode when taxiing, just because it's kind of nice to have everything at the ready. However, if you want a little bit cleaner screen, this is where we can go down into the hover mode. And again, remember the circle indicates the level of input that's being put in to the helicopter cyclic. The solid line that's moving around there indicates the speed at which it's going to do so. The longer the solid line is, the faster the aircraft's going to go. Okay, now let's talk about the tail wheel. We talked about that a minute ago. For example, right now, if I start adding some cyclic, and I hit full left torque there, anti-torque pedal, the aircraft is turning, but what's happening is I'm actually dragging the wheel around. The wheel is not turning. Let's see if it models that. There you go. You saw that the wheel wasn't turning with the tail rotor, and that's because it's locked. So what we want to do is depress that nose wheel button, that left shift S that I had bound, the tail wheel lock unlock. And now you can see an illumination down here that we were talking about earlier, showing that the tail wheel is now unlocked. So now when I do so, the tail wheel should caster with the direction of the anti-torque rotor. Just like that. Okay, so it's really important to understand that yes, it will turn. Just keep in mind what it's doing. So if you notice it's sort of jolting and jogging around, chances are that the tail wheel is not unlocked. And always be looking for that green illumination down there indicating that it is. All right, so now at this point, let's go ahead and start taxiing to the taxiway. The tail wheel is unlocked. Actually, I don't think it is. Yes, it is. Okay. The tail wheel lock unlock button or screen warning came up, so I got worried that I bumped it again. So now I will tell you that with the tail wheel unlocked, the aircraft is significantly more unstable in taxi. Significantly more stable. And you're going to find yourself constantly trying to fight that caster. Once you get on a straight line, your desired course line, if you will, for taxi, you're going to want to travel straight for a few seconds and lock that tail wheel up. Now I'm going to show you can do that at any time, because what's keeping that tail wheel in place is a locking pin that drops down when you tell it to lock. But that pin can only fall into position when the tail wheel is straight. So I'm going to try my best here. Taxiing is still something I'm very much so getting used to. It's very goofy getting used to it, because also your left and right movements on the cyclic are also going to affect the taxi. So unless you're really straight on. Alright, so right about there, I'm going to tap that tail wheel lock button again and just travel forward. And now I can let my feet go from the rudder pedals. But again, I'm not straight down the taxiway, but it's close enough, you know. I don't have to worry about fighting it, but I am drifting a little bit. And if at any point I need to turn it, like I said, you can just kick it over. But remember, at this point, what I'm doing right here is I'm dragging that tail wheel again. So I don't know if any damage is actually simulated in it, but it's not ideal. So just keep that in mind. You want to sort of, you know, fly it the way we're supposed to fly it here, right? All right, so let's go ahead and stop the aircraft here. Brakes. And now let's talk about some flying. We're going to do a quick lift and talk about hover and trimming for a second. Now, before we get started, the biggest thing I want to tell you guys about flying a helicopter that I have found over any simulator, Microsoft Flight Simulator, DCS, it doesn't matter, less is more. Meaning that you want to think really gentle control movements. You very rarely in a helicopter are you going to be making dramatic, very large movements on the cyclic. What you are going to be doing is making a bunch of small movements on the cyclic. And this is no different. And it's really important to remember that. The larger movements you try to make, the more frustrated and the more fighting with the helicopter you're going to wind up doing. So it sort of takes some mental focus, if you will, to really pay attention to it's not the jets that we're used to flying. And if you try to fly it like one, you're going to put yourself in a bad spot and be frustrated with it. All right, so we're going to be real gentle, and what I'm going to do first, I'm just going to start adding some collective. I'm not going to touch the cyclic. I'm just going to add a bit of collective and see what the aircraft's doing. Now you can see it's going to the right here. So I know that I'm going to need left anti-torque, right? So I'm going to start adding that in. Now, added a little bit of left anti-torque pedal to start straightening that nose out. But now we know that we're drifting to the right, right? Let me settle it back down before we end up in a bad spot. So I know that I'm going to have to come left on the cyclic too. So now we're going to do a little bit of both, but very, very, very little movements. You know what? How do you do that? There we go. So if you guys can see, let me pull the collective back a little bit. There on the bottom, in the top left of the screen, that's my rudder pedals. There's my cyclic. There's the collective. Okay, so hopefully that'll help you guys understand what I'm doing at least. Okay, and so now I'm adding a little bit of after torque, adding collective. It's sort of one big harmonious thing. And again, I'm going to try to keep that circle right in the center of that crosshair and bring the aircraft straight up. Now I know it's already trying to go to the left, so I'm coming left with the cyclic a little bit to compensate. or excuse me, coming right. Sorry, I knew that was wrong when I said it. Oh, there we go. Coming left. There we go. And just give yourself time. So we know we're drifting backwards and to the right. And again, I'm no pro. I'm just trying to show you guys how I do it. And you can either chase that circle around and drive yourself nuts, or pick a spot out in front, like those buildings, and just try to keep them in one spot of the plane. It's a lot easier to look down range than it is to focus on that little dot that's right in front of you, at least in the beginning. Okay, and then what you can do is with our trimmer button, we're going to put force trim up once we get into a nice, comfortable spot. And then once I hit that trim button, I'm going to center my controls again, and then just slowly keep readjusting. Trim up. Oh, got a little too much there. You still, even with the trimmer, you still don't let your hands off the controls and be ready to still add more correction. Otherwise, you're going to do what I just did and give yourself more work than what you needed. But trimming. Okay. And again, it's practice. It's just a matter of getting used to the aircraft, guys. Okay. So anyway, and then if you guys, we were talking earlier about the hover baba. If we go down, okay, down again, there's our target. So now my goal is to keep that circle actually in the center of the bigger octagon there. And that will not only put us in a hover. So the idea is to get them all to line up. You can get them all to line up right in the center. And it follows the same rules as anything else. So now we're ahead of our spot. Remember, it's picking out a point in space. And if you can get them all to lock up in the center. Oh, I keep going forward. I need to come back. So I'm backing up. I want to bring that octagon forward, so I have to back up. Now I have to come to the left. Now I have to stop that forward momentum. You guys hopefully can see the relationship. Again, I've had this aircraft as long as you guys have had. But hopefully you can see the relationship to what I'm trying to do and what the goal there is. Alright, I'm not going to spend too much time on that. Obviously, I'm still a noob too. But we can go back to just hit Symbology down switch again. And we've got a pretty decent hover there. And that's just using the trim. My hands are off the controls right now. Completely off the controls. And so you can see we're starting to creep forward a little bit, which is fine. So now let's talk about rotation or transition. So I'm going to go back into transition mode. So now we have our flight path indicator. And I'm not really adding any collective. Notice we're still at 63%. And I'm just going to start pushing the nose forward. Actually, if anything, it went down a little bit. There we go. Added a little bit more. And as you pitch it forward, she'll start to rise on her own without adding any further power. We're still right about 64, 63%. Okay? Now, we're looking at the controls on the side here. The biggest one that I want you guys to be aware of is the triangle that's on the right-hand side there. That's your vertical velocity indicator. That's how fast you are climbing or descending. So if I pitch the nose way down, notice that the altitude's starting to drop. Okay? Probably about 200 feet per minute. But if I put it right on the money, let's try to get it there, and then hit my trimmer hat. Okay? And just do it again. And each time I hit my trim hat, the aircraft's getting closer and closer to where I want. Now, we've got some pretty intense wind in this mission. I have the wind set to dynamic, so I have no idea what the wind speeds are. And that's why the aircraft is crabbing so bad. Notice our flight path director is over here, but the nose is pointed out here. That's the wind doing that. Okay, it's just called crabbing. That's not a big deal. Okay, it's very normal for aircraft, especially down low and on approaches. You'll actually crab into your position, and then at the last second you'll use your rudder pedals like on an airplane, kick the nose straight for landing. But there we go, and it makes it much easier to fly. So speaking of flying, now let's talk about just some tips about maneuvering the aircraft. Okay, a lot of we all do, right? And first I'm going to hit the trim down switch so you guys can see what it does. Oh wait, nope. Sorry, I haven't shown you the attitude hold yet. My bad. My bad. My bad. So first, let's lock into a position here. So let's say I want to do a really cool orbit, right? So I'm going to bring it around like this. Now I'm trying to make sure we get into a relatively level flight. So I'm watching that vertical velocity indicator. Okay. Now I'm going to hit trim left. This is the attitude force trim that I was telling you about. So I hit that left. Now I'm letting completely go of the controls. My feet are off the anti-torque pedals, my hands off the flight stick or the cyclic, right? And we're descending a little bit, and that's because of just bad trimming on my part. Okay, but you can see it's starting to balance out there quite a bit. And there we goes, leveling out. You can see there's a box around our airspeed indicator indicating that the aircraft is controlling that. But now we can be in a pretty good orbit. Simply by using that force trim. Now here's where the trim down switch comes to play. You hit trim down, you get that alert tone, and it's disconnected. And now we can resume control of the aircraft. Alright, so now let's just talk about basic controls. And this is where I told you less is more. Alright, so even if you want to be a hot shot, right? You want to bring it down, that's fine. But watch my control input up there, okay? And by the way, the X is the current trim position. Okay, so even if you want to bring it in, you can still do that. But I'm not doing a whole lot. I'm using the anti-torque pedals, though, to coordinate the turn. You can still pull pretty tight on this. Just watch your airspeed like any other aircraft. But gentle. Even if you want to do something quick. Notice the movement isn't extreme compared to that of a fighter that we would do. You can still pull back. You can still grip it and rip it. We can still increase that torque for a second. I had someone in one of my previous flight sim videos ask me what do I have against altitude? Because altitude doesn't feel like you're doing what we're doing here. Just something about gripping the ground low, man. But so just be gentle at first. Use those curves that I showed you guys earlier in the axis tunings. Get familiar with the aircraft and then get more and more ballsy. You know, so the last thing I'll show you guys real quick is lately how I am working on my landings. Okay. So to work on a landing here, first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to start reducing the collective, and as I reduce the collective, I'm going to pull aft on the stick, trying to maintain altitude, but as I drop the collective, the altitude or our vertical velocity rate is going to drop. And I like to stay in transition mode and continue to trim just like you normally would because it makes it easier to control it. And just keep going until we reduce that speed. Let's aim for that brown square there. Watch that descent rate. You don't want your descent rate to drop too fast. You know what? We'll aim for right in front of those buildings there. And now I'm looking at the flight path indicator. The flight path indicator is what's going to tell me what I want to know the most. And it can even stay over there in the left. Oh. And the more, remember, the slower the aircraft's going, the more anti-torque you're going to have to use to keep it on point. Now again, we're fighting this stupid wind. I probably should have just disabled that. And notice the relationship between the flight path indicator going up and our vertical velocity going up. Okay? The idea is to sort of keep it right there. I just want to keep it right about where my spot is there. That's my target. Remember, the vertical velocity or the flight path indicator is telling you where the aircraft's going to end if you don't make any changes. And again, everything's real gentle. Watch those controls up there at the top left. Very gentle. There's no such thing as hard movements when learning a helicopter. And then from here, I'm no longer watching the flight path indicator. Now I'm just doing the old look out the window kind of thing. And just sort of set her down. Pull that collective back. And there she goes. Alright, well guys, I really hope that you found some of these tips useful, and I hope that you didn't just find this a waste of your time. My goal is really just to try to help more of you guys get to where I was at today. It took me a couple hours to really get up and flying with it. I was just trying to shave a little bit of that time off for you guys. I really hope it helped. Let me know down in the comments below if you guys want me to keep doing these as I learn more. And as always, thanks for all the support. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll see you in the next one.